I'm Delia Malone. I'm an ecologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program. And in that role, I've conducted biological and ecological surveys, both of upland and wetland habitats across Colorado. Sarah, one of my colleagues, has already described our role at CNHP. So I won't go into that except to say that in my Sierra Club role, we are working with CNHP to implement those data that Sarah has collected with the BRAT and other data. So I also I'm the volunteer wildlife chair for the Colorado chapter of the Sierra Club. And in that role, I advocate for the recovery of native species, including gray wolves and beaver and many others. In my spare time, I also teach ecology and conservation biology in the sustainability program at Colorado Mountain College in the Roaring Fork Valley. Before jumping in, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Sherry Tippie, who, at least in Colorado, began the push to restore beaver so many decades ago. She's so awesome and she's so inspirational. So thank you, Sherry. We've heard such good science that informs how important beaver are to enabling healthy ecosystems that provide ecosystems with essential services. I want to change the discussion a little bit to speak with you about how we bring that information to the general public and to policymakers so that the science is implemented. I'll be bringing my experience from electing wolves to Colorado and the ongoing process of determining a wolf management plan to the planning for restoring beaver to Colorado's stream systems. We know from all the discussion that we've heard so far that keystone species structure ecosystem processes that enable sustainable systems, such as hydrologic cycling, nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, including carbon sequestration. Beaver create ponds that dramatically alter the local habitat and in aggregate, the entire ecosystem. We've heard that the science that documents and establishes the role that beaver have in providing critical environmental services that beaver deliver to humans. Perhaps the most essential is the enabling of connections, those connections that enable ecosystem processes that even moderate our warming climate. But like wolf recovery, beaver recovery struggles. For some inexplicable reason, those data seem to be insufficient to change policy and management. Next, please. So the wolf election to Colorado changed literally 140 years of dominance by the livestock industry when wolves were elected to Colorado by the public. And even though decades of science regarding the very essential value of wolves instructs that wolves are a keystone species, essential to restoring a natural dynamic balance, wolf recovery struggles. Decades of science similarly instructs that beaver are a keystone species that provide all of the essential value that has just been described. Yet, beaver are often categorized and managed by wildlife agencies as a nuisance. Thus, the first lesson from the wolf election process that I can bring to beaver restoration is the imperative to continually explain the ecological necessity for restoring a native species. Another lesson is that we must engage all of the public, especially those Coloradans who traditionally do not intrinsically value beaver. Conflict in wildlife management is increasingly common. In my role as wildlife chair in the Colorado chapter of the Sierra Club, I come face to face with these conflicts almost on a daily basis. I would posit that the social context of wildlife management is key to understanding and resolving these wildlife conflicts. I'd point to a recent, really excellent study from CSU by Manfredo and his colleagues that describes how the public views wildlife and how these perspectives shape wildlife management. This and other studies strongly suggest that the key to recovering species, including beaver, lies with changing wildlife value orientations to mutualistic views of wildlife. In such a view, wildlife is viewed as a companion that deserves the care and rights of humans. This is compared with a, quote, domination view, where wildlife is viewed as subordinate to human priorities. And along with that view, that wildlife should be used in ways that benefit humans, such as hunting and trapping. Relating this concept to Colorado and the recovery of native species, mutualists in those states where mutualists are a majority of the population, such as Colorado, are more likely to agree that we should strive for environmental and wildlife protection. And equally important, unfortunately, the value of the state's public is often not reflected in wildlife agencies. Indeed, this study also found that where 34% on average of the public are mutualists, only 8% of agency employees are mutualists. This contradiction is seen now in many of our wildlife management decisions, including beaver reintroductions and recovery. Next slide, please. There are many similarities between beaver and wolves, oddly enough. Both are keystone species. Both are often considered a nuisance to the ranching industry, to rural communities. And yet, although in science informs that both beaver and wolves are essential to functioning ecosystems, both have often been rendered ecologically ineffective, despite the science that clearly informs of the importance of both. Next slide, please. Our current focus. Stable, functioning ecosystems, as many of the scientists here have described, provide humans with services that are essential to life, including carbon sequestration, clean air and water, pollination and food protection. These services are provided by climate, carbon, water, and nutrient cycles. Biodiversity enables those cycles that provide us with these ecosystem services. And as Sarah and others have discussed, biodiversity is enhanced by the presence of beaver. As important as are these services, there is a poverty to the stance of focusing only on services. I've heard so many times while conducting bird surveys on ranches or other places, well, that's just another yellow bird. What good is it? Or that's just another small vole or deer mouse or shrew. What good is it? That's where, next slide, please. That's where we need to make a little bit of an addition to this concept of ecosystem services, which is critically important. But I would suggest that nature's intrinsic value is an axiom of conservation, that there hasn't been nearly enough focus on creating or promoting intrinsic motivation for protecting and restoring nature. Research and the evidence and the experience from Colorado shows that the common paradigm of motivating the public to adopt conservation behaviors primarily through ecosystem rewards is not nearly enough. And instead, we should consider integrating intrinsic values of conservation. Next, please. So how do we get there? How do we do that? What I've learned is that change usually comes from the grassroots up. And that change is due to determined and persistent efforts of many, many determined citizens. We've got to ask then, why are beaver populations, wolf populations, ferrets, lynx, grizz, why are they much reduced or absent? My experience from decades of working on wolf reintroduction is that that is due to a disconnect between science and between politics and science and between science and the public. Next slide, please. Research and experience and evidence from ongoing restoration projects in Colorado, from plants to fish to amphibians to mammals and birds, informs that a change in human habit attitude is singly the most important factor in making recovery possible. So how do we accomplish this change in attitude, this paradigm shift? A question: do people best protect nature when they stand to gain from it economically, or from the ecosystem services that nature provides, or when their love of nature is its own reward? Research and experience and evidence also instructs that where utilitarian benefits, these ecosystem service benefits, are accompanied by a sense of kinship. From orangutans in Indonesia to wolves in the Northern Rockies, people are much more likely to change their attitudes when they are accompanied by a sense of kinship with the landscape. Next, please. So how do we reconnect people? How do we build that sense of kinship with the landscape? And in so doing, reconnect the landscape? Driven by science, Sierra Club is working with, for instance, CNHP and with Sarah to implement the beaver restoration tool in high elevation ecosystems, first to identify suitable sites, and then to work with citizens to start the implementation and the restoration. I've found that it primarily involves getting people out into our wildlands, reconnecting their values with wildlife values. My experience with my students at CMC has reaffirmed the essential importance of getting people out to experience wildlife and wildlands and into beaver ponds. My students are always shocked by the abundance of water in an otherwise arid landscape, by the abundance of wildlife in an otherwise depauperate landscape. As far as planning goes, Sierra Club's expertise is really in organizing our volunteers. So we're organizing our own Beaver Believer team to implement the science that is so well founded to restore beavers to Colorado's high elevation ecosystems in the Roaring Fork watershed, over in Summit County and elsewhere. Beginning with educating our team by evaluating site suitability, as Mark was describing, and then beginning education on hands-on implementation strategies. We're coordinating with local Audubon societies to monitor the before and after impacts of restoring beaver to sites. Roaring Fork Audubon and other local Audubon groups are doing baseline surveys to monitor the condition before, and then we will monitor afterwards. Birds are excellent indicators of biotic integrity and can tell us if we're doing our job. We're also organizing with agencies such as the Forest Service, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and our local counties. Pickett County has been especially enthusiastic about concepts of beaver restoration. We have in our county a tax levy on sales tax, and part of that fund goes to support the Healthy Streams Initiative, and part of that money we are suggesting go to restoration of beaver at high elevation sites. And working with agencies, really important to work with agencies such as CPW to develop wildlife friendly management. I mentioned earlier in the day that we had worked with CPW to help get past the license plate fee, and part of that fee will go towards funding the SWAP, the State Wildlife Action Plan. Although the beaver is not listed as a swap species, I think the CPW biologists are totally invested in the concept that beaver are important to providing habitat for several swap species, including fish and amphibian and bird species. So I'm going to close by quoting one of my very favorite wolf scientists, John Vucetich, who speaks to our, quote, first obligation as moral creatures is to figure out what is right and then behave accordingly. Our second obligation is to work like hell to persuade recalcitrant non-believers. So thank you so much for indulging my left turn to speak about intrinsic valuation in combination with good, strong science to drive beaver restoration in Colorado.
Delia, thank you so much. That was really great. I really appreciated the perspective that you brought that we haven't necessarily heard so far. And so that was great.
Well, absolutely, my pleasure. If there's any questions or thoughts or comments about other people we need to engage with or about strategies, I am just anxious to hear that.
I just checked the question box and I didn't see any new ones in there. Let's see if there were some in the chat. Yes. Delia, we met in Wolf Creek with your class when Tom Grant led our project, and this is from Andrew. We would like to invite you to Gunnison again. We have a lot of projects planned for 2022 across BLM and CPW lands. That's great news, of course. Beaver work after Ecometrics set up the projects and CNHP with pre-project monitoring. Nice presentation, thanks. So,
absolutely, we'll absolutely take you up on that invitation. And just let me know when, and we will organize a group to come over there, and maybe we can get you over here.
Here's another question. What is the study you cited about mutualists in wildlife agencies and plants?
The study is out of Colorado State University, and I'm not going to remember all the authors, but the lead author is Manfredo, M-A-N-F-R-E-D-O. I think you just can Google Manfredo, Colorado State University. I can actually, if there's a email for you, I can even email you the paper.
Great, thanks. Or you could also, when your talk is over with, you could put it in the chat box when you don't have to concentrate on answering questions.
Good idea. I will put up a link to that study up in the chat box.
Another question, is there anyone working on beaver restoration on the eastern slope of Colorado? We're going to hear from Dallas May and his ranch, but that's not necessarily restoration. He's basically just letting the beaver, continue to live there. And so do you happen to know, our folks that are our panelists know about Eastern Plains restoration projects?
They might, but let me jump in and just put in a plug for our Sierra Club groups. So Sierra Club has groups all over Colorado, and all of our groups are hugely excited about the concept of beaver restoration and being able to muck around in beaver ponds. It's great fun. There's a very active group down in Pueblo who's hugely excited, as well as up in Fort Collins. So if there's any interest in engaging with those groups, the difference, I think, probably the biggest difference with Sierra Club is that we are a volunteer-led group. Our volunteers determine the projects that we're going to invest in, both with money and with volunteers. And so we've got several groups on the West Slope that have already committed to this, and we're gung-ho and we're active. And so there are groups on the Front Range that I know that are interested. So again, if you'd like to reach out to me and be interested in getting involved to help make that happen, that would be great.
Great.
Becky, I think Joanne had works with Sarah up in Fort Collins. I think she mentioned that EPA has provided a grant for some of their folks to start to look at the Eastern Plains. Sarah may have more information on that, but Joanne mentioned that a couple months ago.
Yeah, before we jump on to the next question I see in the chat box, I just want to open it up to our panelists if anybody wants to chime in on that Eastern Plains question.
Well, I would just chime in that there's pretty much beaver related restoration going on from the eastern side of the divide out, and it's becoming more and more common. There's beaver related restoration along I-25 down near Monument. There are projects in Boulder County, certainly on the eastern side of Rocky Mountain National Park. So it's definitely becoming a lot more common. I saw in the comments from Anna that there's some work going on around Greeley too, which is exciting to see. So starting to
There's
see a lot more.
also some interesting work on Fountain Creek down by Colorado Springs as Fountain Creek exits out onto the plains.
Mark Vieira, Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And without being able to get into specifics, I know that I put it in the chat too, but we certainly have local officers and staff that are involved in using beavers on local levels all along the Front Range as well.
Great, thanks, Mark. Okay, I know that there's a couple more questions, so hold on just a second. Let's see, there was one about how can we engage Sierra Club in Grand County? So that was another one I saw in there, Delia.
Hopefully my email info is up somewhere on this site. So just give me a shout and I will connect. I'll connect you with the right folks. And similarly, anybody else out there that wants to get involved with our efforts on this, please give me a shout and I will help orchestrate that.